Before you open that door, remember this moment, because everything you think you know about power is about to change. I still remember the sound of that knock at 6:17 in the morning. 3 firm knocks against my front door that cut through the quiet of my home like a warning. My coffee was sitting on the kitchen counter, the morning news was playing softly in the background, and for a few seconds I thought maybe I had misunderstood the sound. Then I looked through the window and saw the police cruiser parked along the curb. My name is Michael Carter, and I had lived in Silver Oak Estates for years believing that a good neighborhood was built on respect, communication, and trust. I never expected my own front porch to become the place where a simple HOA disagreement would turn into something much bigger. Standing outside were 2 officers and Victoria Reynolds, the president of our homeowners association. She held a thick folder against her chest like she had already prepared the entire story before anyone asked a question. Victoria had always been confident. She believed the HOA existed to protect the community, and in many ways, that was true. Rules mattered. Standards mattered. But somewhere along the way, something changed. The rules that were supposed to keep neighbors connected started feeling like tools used to create pressure. My issue was never with having guidelines. I understood why communities needed them. My issue was fairness. I had received multiple notices about my property over the previous months. Each time, I responded respectfully. I provided explanations, asked questions, and followed the process. But every answer seemed to create another question. That morning, Victoria told the officers that the HOA had documented concerns regarding my property and wanted the situation formally addressed. I listened carefully because I knew one thing mattered more than emotions. Facts. I asked the officers what specific issue they needed to discuss. They explained they were there to understand the complaint and make sure everyone had the opportunity to speak clearly. I appreciated that because I was not looking for a fight. I was looking for fairness. Victoria seemed surprised by how calm I was. Maybe she expected anger. Maybe she expected frustration. But after months of dealing with notices and paperwork, I had learned something important. The person with the strongest argument does not need the loudest voice. They need the clearest evidence. Then, just as the conversation reached a pause, I heard footsteps behind me. My wife, Emily, walked down the hallway toward the front entrance. She had just returned from an early assignment, and she had no idea why there were officers standing outside our home. But the moment she stepped beside me, the atmosphere changed. She was wearing her uniform, not as a symbol of status, not as a way to demand attention. It was simply part of who she was and the responsibility she carried every day. Victoria looked at Emily, then looked back at the officers, and I noticed something I had never seen before. Uncertainty. She had expected a homeowner who would feel overwhelmed by the situation. She had expected the complaint to speak louder than anything else. What she did not expect was someone standing beside me who understood discipline, procedure, and accountability. That morning, Victoria thought she was bringing authority to my doorstep. She did not realize she was about to learn that true authority is not about controlling people. It is about respecting the truth. After Emily stepped beside me that morning, I noticed something I had never seen before from Victoria Reynolds. For the first time since this entire situation began, she did not seem completely certain of herself. It was not because Emily said anything intimidating. She did not raise her voice. She did not mention her position. She simply stood there calmly, and that calmness changed the entire feeling of the conversation. That was the first thing people often misunderstood about Emily. They saw the uniform and assumed it represented power. But to Emily, the uniform represented responsibility. She had spent years learning that authority was not about making people feel smaller. It was about making sure every situation was handled with fairness, patience, and respect. After the officers finished reviewing the complaint details, they explained that the matter would need to follow the proper process. They were not there to decide who was right or wrong in a neighborhood disagreement. They were there because someone had requested assistance, and they wanted to make sure everyone understood what was happening. That answer seemed to frustrate Victoria because she had expected the situation to move faster. She believed bringing official attention to my doorstep would immediately create pressure. Instead, it created questions. After the officers left, Emily and I stood in the entryway of our home for a few moments without saying anything. I looked at the folder Victoria had brought and thought about how much power people sometimes give to paperwork without looking at what is actually inside it. A notice can sound official. A complaint can sound serious. But words on paper still need facts behind them. Emily looked at me and said something I will never forget. She told me that the best way to handle a difficult situation was not to fight harder. It was to understand better. That was when I decided to stop reacting to each new notice separately and start looking at the entire picture. Over the next few days, I gathered every document related to the HOA situation. I organized the letters, emails, property guidelines, and previous conversations. I created a timeline showing when each notice arrived and how I responded. I was not doing this because I wanted revenge. I was doing it because I wanted clarity. The more I reviewed everything, the more I noticed small details that did not make sense. Some explanations changed from one letter to the next. Some requests seemed different from what was written in the community guidelines. None of these things alone proved anything, but together they created a pattern that deserved a closer look. Emily helped me organize the information, but she always reminded me to stay focused on the facts. She never wanted me to turn the situation into a personal battle with Victoria. She believed the strongest position was the one built on honesty and preparation. Meanwhile, Victoria continued telling neighbors that the HOA was simply enforcing community standards. She was not wrong that standards mattered, but she was missing the question that mattered most. Were those standards being applied equally to everyone? That question stayed with me as I reviewed every document on my kitchen table, because I was beginning to realize something important. The issue was no longer just about one complaint against my home. It was about whether the system protecting the community was actually treating everyone in the community fairly. The more time I spent reviewing the documents, the more I realized that the complaint against my home was only one small piece of a much larger picture. At first, I thought I was simply trying to understand why the HOA had taken such an aggressive approach toward me. But after organizing every letter, every email, and every notice, I began to see something that changed the entire direction of the situation. The question was no longer why they had challenged me. The question was whether they had been applying the same standards to everyone. I spent several evenings at my kitchen table with stacks of paperwork spread out in front of me. Each document represented a different moment in the timeline. A warning letter, a response I had sent, a request for clarification, a follow-up notice. When everything was separated, each event seemed small. But when everything was placed together, the pattern became much clearer. Emily sat across from me as I reviewed the records. She did not rush me. She simply asked questions that helped me look at the situation differently. She reminded me that emotions could make people focus on the wrong details. Facts were what created understanding. That was one of the reasons I trusted her judgment so much. She had spent years in environments where preparation mattered and assumptions could create unnecessary problems. One evening, Emily noticed something unusual while comparing my notices with the HOA guidelines. The wording in some of the letters did not fully match the actual community rules. Some requirements appeared stricter than what was written in the official documents. Again, it was not one single detail that proved something was wrong. It was the collection of details that created concern. I decided the next step was not to argue with Victoria or send another emotional response. Instead, I requested access to additional HOA records. I wanted to understand how decisions were being made, not just challenge the decisions themselves. That difference was important. I believed a fair system should be able to answer reasonable questions. When Victoria received my request, her response was polite but noticeably different from before. She did not dismiss my concerns immediately. She explained that the HOA would review the request and provide the appropriate information. It was a small change, but I noticed it. The confidence she had shown when she arrived with officers at my door was no longer the same. She was beginning to realize that the situation could not be solved by simply repeating the authority of the HOA. Meanwhile, other neighbors started reaching out to me. Some asked about the documents I had collected. Others shared stories about their own experiences with HOA decisions. They were not looking for conflict. They wanted to know whether they were the only ones who had questions. That was when I understood this situation had grown beyond my personal disagreement. A community is built by people who trust each other, and trust depends on transparency. Without transparency, even reasonable rules can create frustration. A few weeks earlier, Victoria believed the complaint against my home would end the conversation. She believed the presence of officers would make me step back. Instead, it pushed me to look closer. And the closer I looked, the more I realized that the biggest issue was not the notice sitting on my counter. It was the system behind it. The community meeting at Silver Oak Estates was scheduled for a Thursday evening, and by the time I arrived, I could already feel that something had changed. The room was more crowded than usual. Neighbors who normally stayed quiet were sitting together, looking through copies of documents and discussing questions they wanted answered. This was no longer just a conversation between me and the HOA. People wanted to understand how decisions were being made inside their own community. I walked into the meeting carrying the same folder I had organized at my kitchen table. It was not filled with accusations. It was filled with records. That difference mattered. Emily sat beside me, wearing her uniform, but she remained quiet. She was not there to speak over anyone or create pressure. She was there as my wife and as someone who understood the importance of following the right process. Victoria Reynolds opened the meeting by explaining that the HOA had always acted to protect the neighborhood. She spoke confidently and reminded everyone that rules existed for a reason. I agreed with that statement. Rules did exist for a reason, but rules only worked when they were applied consistently. When it was my turn to speak, I stood up and explained what I had found. I did not accuse Victoria of intentionally doing anything wrong. I did not attack the board members. I simply placed the documents on the table and asked questions that deserved answers. I showed the timeline of notices I had received. I explained the different explanations I had been given. I asked why certain situations appeared to receive different treatment from others. The room became noticeably quieter. Some neighbors looked at each other because they recognized similar experiences. Victoria looked through the documents carefully. For the first time, she was not responding to a complaint. She was reviewing information she had not seen presented this way before. Emily leaned toward me and quietly reminded me to stay focused. She told me that the goal was not to embarrass anyone. The goal was to make sure the process was fair. That was exactly why I respected her so much. She understood that real strength came from controlling emotions and allowing facts to lead the conversation. As the meeting continued, more homeowners began sharing their own concerns. One resident explained that they had struggled to understand certain HOA decisions in the past. Another homeowner mentioned that communication from the board could sometimes feel unclear. Nobody was demanding that the HOA disappear. Nobody was asking for chaos. They wanted something much simpler. They wanted transparency. Victoria listened as more people spoke. I could see that the conversation was affecting her. She had entered the meeting expecting to defend the HOA against one homeowner's complaint. Instead, she found an entire community asking for better communication. At the end of the meeting, the board agreed to review the concerns and examine the procedures used when handling homeowner issues. It was not a dramatic victory. There was no shouting and no one walked away defeated. But something important happened that night. The conversation finally moved from who was right to what was fair. As I left the meeting with Emily beside me, I thought about the morning when officers had arrived at my front door. Victoria believed that moment would make me back down. She never realized it would become the moment that pushed me to ask the questions everyone else had been afraid to ask. After the HOA meeting ended, I expected things to move slowly. Real change rarely happens after one conversation, especially when people are forced to look closely at decisions they have made for years. But what happened next surprised me. The questions raised during that meeting did not disappear when everyone went home. They continued through emails, private conversations, and additional reviews of HOA records. For the first time, the focus was not on defending a decision. The focus was on understanding how that decision was made. A few days later, I received access to additional documents from the HOA office. I sat at my kitchen table with Emily beside me, and we began reviewing everything carefully. The more pages we examined, the clearer the situation became. The problem was not one notice, one conversation, or one disagreement. It was a pattern of decisions that needed a closer look. There were records showing different approaches to similar situations. Some homeowners appeared to receive more opportunities to resolve issues before receiving penalties, while others faced stricter responses. Again, the details mattered. We were not looking for a reason to attack anyone. We were looking for consistency. Emily reminded me that fairness was not about making everyone receive the exact same answer in every situation. Fairness was about making sure every person was evaluated using the same standards. That idea changed how I viewed the entire situation. Before, I was focused on proving that the HOA had treated me unfairly. Now, I was focused on understanding whether the system itself needed improvement. Victoria also began approaching the situation differently. She requested more information from the board members and started asking questions about previous decisions. I could tell she was no longer simply defending the HOA. She was trying to understand what had happened. That was an important change because accountability does not begin when someone admits they are wrong. It begins when someone becomes willing to look honestly at the facts. Meanwhile, more residents started sharing their own experiences. Some had questions about communication. Others wanted clearer explanations when receiving notices. Their concerns were different, but the common theme was the same. People wanted to feel respected by the organization representing their neighborhood. Emily often told me that trust is built through small actions repeated over time. One apology does not rebuild trust. One meeting does not rebuild trust. Trust comes from showing people that their concerns are taken seriously. A few weeks later, the HOA board announced that it would conduct a full review of its procedures for handling homeowner concerns. They planned to examine how notices were written, how decisions were documented, and how residents could request clarification. When I heard that announcement, I realized something important. The goal was never to defeat the HOA. The goal was to make sure the HOA worked the way it was supposed to work. Looking back, I thought about the moment Victoria stood outside my home with officers beside her. She believed that official pressure would end the disagreement before it grew. But that decision created the exact opposite result. It encouraged me to look deeper. It encouraged neighbors to speak openly. And it forced the HOA to examine itself. The biggest change was not that one person won and another person lost. The biggest change was that people finally started asking the right questions. The weeks following the HOA review were filled with something I had not expected. Silence. Not the uncomfortable silence that existed before, when neighbors avoided difficult conversations and homeowners quietly accepted decisions they did not fully understand. This was a different kind of silence. It was the silence of people watching carefully, waiting to see whether promises would become actions. I understood that changing a system required more than one meeting and more than a few conversations. Trust had been damaged over time, and rebuilding it would take patience. Emily reminded me that real improvement was measured by what people did after the conversation ended. Anyone could make promises during a difficult moment. The important part was whether those promises continued when nobody was watching. A month later, the HOA board presented its findings and announced several changes to the community. They created a clearer process for homeowners to request reviews, improved communication about violations, and established better documentation procedures. These changes were not designed to remove rules. They were designed to make sure the rules were understandable and applied consistently. For many residents, that was the difference they had been hoping for. They did not want fewer standards. They wanted confidence that those standards were fair. Victoria Reynolds also changed the way she approached her role. I noticed it during the next community meeting. She spent less time explaining why previous decisions were made and more time asking residents what could be improved. That was a small change, but it showed growth. Leadership is not about always having the perfect answer. Sometimes leadership means being willing to listen when the answer is uncomfortable. After the meeting, Victoria approached me near the entrance. The same place where months earlier she had stood with a folder of complaints and complete confidence that the matter was already decided. This time, she looked different. She was not there to defend a position. She was there to have a conversation. She admitted that she had focused so much on enforcing the HOA rules that she had forgotten something important. Behind every notice was a person. Behind every property was a family. Behind every disagreement was an opportunity to communicate better. I appreciated her honesty because I knew that acknowledging a mistake was not easy. I told her that my goal was never to make the HOA look bad. I wanted the organization to become better for everyone who lived there. Emily joined us briefly and reminded us that responsibility was not about proving who was right. It was about making sure the right thing was done moving forward. That statement perfectly described everything that had happened. The morning the officers arrived at my door could have become a story about conflict. It could have been remembered as a moment where two sides refused to listen. Instead, it became a lesson about patience, preparation, and accountability. When I think about that day now, I do not focus on the surprise of seeing a police cruiser outside my home. I focus on what happened afterward. I focus on the questions that were asked. I focus on the people who became willing to listen. And I focus on the fact that my wife never needed to use her uniform to change the outcome. She changed it by reminding everyone that true authority comes from integrity. Because in the end, the strongest response was never anger. It was the simple decision to stand calmly, tell the truth, and let the facts speak for themselves. After the changes were announced, I expected the community to move forward slowly. I knew rebuilding trust would not happen overnight because trust is not created by one decision or one public statement. It is created by consistent actions repeated over time. What surprised me was how quickly the atmosphere around Silver Oak Estates began to change. The same neighbors who once avoided HOA conversations started becoming more involved. They attended meetings, asked questions, and shared ideas about how the community could improve. The biggest difference was that people no longer felt like they were simply receiving decisions. They felt like they were part of the conversation. I noticed that change during my daily walks through the neighborhood. Before everything happened, many people would simply wave and continue walking. Now, neighbors would stop and talk about community projects, maintenance concerns, and ways to improve communication. Nobody was interested in creating conflict. They were interested in creating a better place to live. Emily noticed the change too. She always believed that communities were strongest when people respected each other enough to have honest conversations. She never viewed the situation as a victory for our family. In her mind, the real success was seeing people become more comfortable speaking up in a respectful way. One evening, we sat outside our home watching the sunset over the neighborhood. Emily looked toward the street and said something that stayed with me. She said that leadership was not measured by how many people followed your instructions. It was measured by how many people trusted your decisions. That was something I thought about often because it explained exactly what had gone wrong in the beginning. The HOA had focused so much on enforcing rules that it had forgotten the importance of maintaining trust. Victoria seemed to understand that lesson as well. Over the following months, I saw her approach change. She began asking more questions before approving decisions. She encouraged board members to consider different perspectives. She made sure homeowners had opportunities to explain their situations before receiving final decisions. It was not a complete transformation of everything overnight, but it was progress. One afternoon, Victoria invited several residents to discuss future community improvements. During the meeting, she asked homeowners what they wanted to see from the HOA moving forward. That simple question showed how much had changed. Before, conversations often started with what residents needed to do. Now, they started with what residents needed from their leadership. I remember looking around the room and realizing how different everything felt compared to the night of the first HOA meeting. Back then, people were waiting to defend themselves. Now, they were working together to improve the community. My experience taught me something I will always remember. Sometimes people think justice means someone losing and someone winning. But the best outcomes are often the ones where everyone learns something important. Victoria learned that authority requires humility. The community learned that respectful questions can create positive change. And I learned that standing up for fairness does not require anger. It requires patience, preparation, and the courage to believe that the truth matters. The same front door where the entire situation began became a daily reminder of that lesson. It reminded me that even a difficult moment can become the starting point for something better when people are willing to listen. As the months passed, I started to realize that the biggest change in Silver Oak Estates was not something people could see from the outside. The houses looked the same. The streets were still quiet. The lawns were still carefully maintained. But something important had changed beneath the surface. People trusted each other more. Neighbors who once stayed silent during meetings were now comfortable sharing their thoughts. Homeowners who once accepted every decision without question began understanding that respectful communication was not a problem. It was part of being a responsible community member. For me, that was the most meaningful result of everything that happened. The goal was never to prove that one person was right and another person was wrong. The goal was to create a system where everyone had a fair opportunity to be heard. Emily continued to remind me of that whenever we talked about the experience. She never looked back at the morning when she stepped outside in uniform as a moment where she changed the outcome. She saw it differently. She believed the real turning point was when everyone decided to slow down and focus on facts instead of assumptions. That was who Emily had always been. She carried herself with discipline because she understood that responsibility came before recognition. She did not need to announce who she was. Her actions showed it. Victoria also continued changing in ways that surprised many residents. She became more open about the challenges the HOA had faced and encouraged more participation from homeowners. During meetings, she started asking residents what they thought before decisions were finalized. She began explaining the reasons behind policies instead of simply reminding people to follow them. It was a small difference, but it created a completely different relationship between the board and the community. One evening, Victoria visited our home to discuss future neighborhood plans. It was a very different scene from the first morning when she arrived with officers and a complaint folder. This time, she came without pressure or expectations. She came simply to talk. She stood near the same front walkway where everything had started and admitted that she had made assumptions about me. She believed I was challenging the HOA because I did not respect the rules. Later, she understood that I was asking questions because I respected the community enough to want those rules handled fairly. That conversation meant a lot because it showed something important. People can change when they are willing to listen. I told Victoria that I appreciated her willingness to review the situation honestly. I also told her that the community would be stronger if everyone remembered that leadership was not about having the final word. It was about creating the right environment for everyone to succeed. Emily joined us for a moment and said something simple that captured everything we had learned. She said that the purpose of rules was never to make people feel powerless. The purpose was to help people live together with respect. Looking back, I understand that the hardest moments often reveal the most important lessons. The morning the HOA sent officers to my door felt like the beginning of a conflict. Instead, it became the beginning of a conversation that changed an entire community. It showed me that patience can be stronger than pressure, that preparation can be stronger than assumptions, and that true leadership comes from serving people rather than controlling them. Years after that morning at my front door, I still remember the sound of those 3 knocks. At the time, I thought they represented the beginning of a difficult battle with my HOA. I thought I would have to spend my time proving that I deserved to be treated fairly. But looking back now, I understand that those knocks represented something completely different. They represented the moment when a community started asking better questions, when people began paying attention, and when everyone learned that fairness requires more than simply having rules. It requires responsibility. Today, Silver Oak Estates feels different. Not because the HOA disappeared or because every disagreement was eliminated. Communities will always have different opinions. What changed was the way people handled those differences. Homeowners became more comfortable speaking with the board. The board became more willing to explain decisions. Conversations replaced assumptions. That was the real improvement. Emily and I still live in the same home where everything began. The front door is the same. The street is the same. The neighborhood looks almost exactly as it did that morning. But every time I walk outside, I remember how much changed because people were willing to slow down and listen. Emily never wanted the story to be about her uniform. She always reminded me that a uniform does not create character. It only represents the responsibility a person chooses to carry. The reason she had such an impact was not because people respected what she wore. It was because they respected how she acted. She stayed calm. She followed the process. She treated everyone with dignity. That was the example she set throughout the entire situation. Victoria also became a reminder that people are capable of growth. When this started, she believed protecting the HOA meant defending every decision the organization had made. Over time, she learned that protecting the community sometimes meant admitting when something needed to improve. That lesson changed the way she approached leadership. She stopped seeing questions as challenges and started seeing them as opportunities to make better decisions. A few months after everything was resolved, I found the original complaint paperwork while organizing old files. I looked at the pages that had once represented frustration and uncertainty. Those same documents now represented something else. They represented the importance of staying organized, remaining patient, and trusting that the truth becomes stronger when it is supported by facts. I realized that the biggest lesson from the entire experience was not about defeating an HOA. It was not about proving one person wrong. It was about understanding what happens when ordinary people decide that fairness matters enough to protect. Some people believe justice arrives through loud arguments or dramatic moments. My experience taught me something different. Justice can arrive quietly. It can arrive through careful preparation, respectful conversations, and people willing to stand by what is right even when the easier choice is to stay silent. The morning officers arrived at my home. Victoria believed she was bringing authority to my doorstep. What she did not realize was that the strongest force in that moment was never a title, a position, or a uniform. It was integrity. And that is the lesson I will always remember. Rules matter. Leadership matters. But above everything else, fairness matters. Because when people choose honesty over pride and responsibility over control, even the most difficult situations can become the beginning of something better.